If you're validating your runs with average pace and your fitness with weekly mileage, you're likely holding yourself back. It's something I call the Strava effect, and I've been there too, and it almost broke me. That faster is fitter approach is why I see so many runners hitting plateaus and regressing in their fitness, having to take time off and losing consistency. In this video, I want to show you why looking at average pace and ignoring heart rate is likely putting you smack in the middle of the gray zone, causing junk miles and ruining your aerobic development. First up, we need to be pretty clear about what pace is, because pace is an output metric, meaning there are all of these millions of biological processes that go on in our body to generate a pace. And that pace is coming from our watch, from a satellite in space. That's a satellite, by the way. So whatever we do internally is going to generate a pace. A pace does not tell us how hard we're working. On a dead flat run in ideal conditions without any wind, pace does very much correlate to the amount of internal work that we're doing. But as soon as we integrate some form of elevation up or down, headwind, tailwind, temperature, distance, duration, all of these factors mean that the amount of energy that we're utilizing can go up and pace does not change. So therefore, pace cannot dictate how hard we're working. We dictate what the pace is, and that's why it's an output metric. When we have something like heart rate, that is an input metric. That is us showing how hard we are working internally. If our pace goes down, we could be running up a hill and our heart rate can go up. Our heart rate therefore shows internally how hard we're working. It is by far not the best metric for interpreting our metabolic or energetic needs at a given time, but is far better than pace. Then more recently, we have power, but that is still an output metric. Although when we go up a hill, our power will go up, and that will correlate more closely with heart rate. However, we can sometimes get a massive drop in power on the downhills, which then does not correlate as well with heart rate, which may sustain, not change, or go down slightly on a downhill, especially if it's quite steep and we're having to work hard at our eccentric load. Then all of these mean that we, one, need to integrate all three, but more importantly, we understand that pace is not the idyllic metric that we think it is, because it can have so many variables internally that it's just not accounting for. So using pace as your sole measure of progress or how well you did in a run and ignoring your heart rate is inevitably going to leave you into the gray zone and produce some junk miles. So when we solely focus on pace, we get into what I call is the Strava effect. I'm not saying that we can completely ignore pace. If we want to cover a set distance in a certain amount of time, we're going to end up with pace, and we're going to need to know what that is. I'm just saying completely relying on pace as the only metric to tell us how well we're doing in training is likely going to lead to the Strava effect. Strava literally puts front and center pace for every run, and then when you Strava stalk someone, you look at the graph. And whether you like to admit it or not, no one wants a graph looking like a Patagonia logo. And that is what almost broke me in 2023. I set out on a standardized base phase after recovering from an ultra marathon. I knew I should take a step back around week 4 or 5, but for whatever reason, I didn't. Then my graph started to look pretty good. And then after 12 weeks of amazing consistency, everything fell apart. I went from hero to zero like that. Luckily, I'm here to report on the mistakes that I've made. It wasn't my first, it will not be my last, so that you can avoid some of those mistakes, or at least identify them early on so that you don't end up having to have a massive step back from your training. I understand that having a Strava upload of a run at an average pace that is achievable by pretty much anyone, and those that you definitely know are way slower than you, can really hurt the ego. But I want to show you how slowing down to get faster is totally legit, and that no slow Strava upload can hurt the ego more than a race that you completely bombed out at. Hands down, the area where I see a pace focus influencing the quality of runners training the most is around zone 3. First and foremost, we need to make sure we understand what our threshold is. If we draw this graph here and we have distance or duration on the x-axis, on the y-axis, we'll call this intensity. So pretty much your standardized power or pace duration curve looks like this. Right, so here, if this is distance or duration, we'll just call this 1K, and then we'll go somewhere along here for 5K, 10K, and then we'll just call this M for marathon. Right, so you're going to be able to run way faster for 1K and 5K than you can for the marathon. Now, there is a point at which this graph almost plateaus. I don't have the steadiest hand, but eventually it would peter out. You know, you can't run forever without breaking down. Somewhere along this line where the plateau is what we would call your steady state threshold. So when you go above this, you have your anaerobic work capacity. Now, in order to run a really good marathon or half marathon, we need to sit in this steady state intensity where we can generate a bit of anaerobic metabolism, so we can generate lactate, the acidity, at a rate that we can buffer it so that we are not completely exhausting our anaerobic work capacity, because when we do, we have to drift back under the curve, under our steady state curve, and run it at an intensity that doesn't require any of our anaerobic work capacity. When we do this, we are looking at something like a marathon. If we started our marathon at an all-out 1K speed, I don't need to tell you that that's probably not going to end well, because you've exhausted your anaerobic work capacity. By setting our anaerobic threshold, this dotted line, we can get an understanding of what intensities correlate to our different distances and our different metabolic environments. This is why knowing your threshold and setting your training zones can be so important for optimizing the effectiveness of your training. I have a how-to guide which is available free in the description. So after you've watched all the way to the end of the video, you can download that, use my calculators, and get everything set up so that when you are running zone 3, it is effective and it's not drifting into the gray zone, causing you to accumulate junk miles, which I'm going to get into now. Zone 3 in many people's eyes is considered the tempo zone. But what does that mean exactly? Tempo isn't just a slight effort above conversational pace, and it's not always directly correlated to marathon pace. It doesn't mean that the faster you run your tempo runs, the faster you do your marathon. Tempo is correlated to the graph I put up before. When we have a muscle, if this is a cross-sectional area of the muscle, we have muscle fibers that all built into this muscle. And these muscle fibers need to be as efficient as possible so that they can use oxygen and fat to produce ATP, the energy currency of the cell, which all together gives us our force for our pace output. The more we can increase all of these things and the efficiency of these fibers, the faster we can run for the same effort. Now, if in our zone 3 runs, we start pushing up into zone 4, we are now in the gray zone. We are entering into a different style of training, one in which we are getting a high acidity, that is hydrogen ions, caused due to the associated lactate production from anaerobic metabolism. We're doing a different kind of session now that we're working above our threshold, because we're starting to integrate carbohydrate into the equation. When we introduce carbohydrate into the equation, we can produce ATP without oxygen. However, oxygen is infinite. We can use as much oxygen as we want, and that is the goal of becoming aerobically fit and increasing our aerobic capacity. But in doing so, we need to make sure our training is specific to do that, because if we start to increase our carbohydrate anaerobic utilization to generate our ATP, we increase our lactate and we increase the acidity. Now we don't have a productive environment to increase the efficiency of all these individual muscle fibers. If we do this chronically, meaning day after day we're always pushing our zone 3 into zone 4, or even worse, our zone 2 into zone 3, we can actually reduce our ability to utilize fat and oxygen. In other words, we reduce our aerobic capacity and we become less fit. That's why some people who come to me, I look at their training and I say, you're actually not fit enough. Despite the fact that you can run a 42-minute 10K, you have no underlying base fitness that's holding up your anaerobic capacity. Once you get past an hour, you'll completely fall apart because you haven't established all of the biological infrastructure that goes along with having a robust aerobic and steady state engine. And all of this is kind of a complex way to say that if we are solely focusing on this output, we neglect this entire biological process that feeds the sole output that we're trying to concentrate on, which ultimately leads to a lot of our training just being junk. And to compound the negative effects of focusing on pace, if we then pile on some arbitrary weekly distance number, now we're not even able to recover from all of the stimulus that we have been applying, although incorrectly, can still be somewhat productive over the long term. But because we're in a chronic state of excessive fatigue or overreaching, we inevitably end up burnt out, overtired, or injured, losing all the consistency in our training, like exactly what happened to me, where I went from 12 weeks of beautiful, consistent training to absolutely nothing. And there's no performance gain to be made if you're stuck on the couch injured. Now, I'm not trying to say that zone 3 training is all bad, or that zone 4 training is all bad, and that all zone 3 or moderate intensity training leads to junk. I'm just saying that when you haven't planned your training and you end up drifting into these zones, so non-specific stress leads to a non-specific adaptation. What we want to make sure we're doing when we are doing our zone 3 workouts to avoid drifting into the gray zone and accumulating junk miles is know exactly what our zone 3 is. For me, that's 88 to around 94, 95%. Really depends what system you're using if you need to round up or down. And so within this could be pace, power, or heart rate. So what I was saying is pace isn't all bad, but I would highly recommend using heart rate if you're going, say, longer than 20 minutes where it can actually stabilize. If you're only doing like 10 minutes, then heart rate may be a bit slow to catch up and you could overexert yourself on the first interval and find yourself underexerting yourself on the third or fourth interval. But I would recommend using heart rate and power for a lot of these. If you live in a temperate climate and it's dead flat, you can absolutely rely on pace. What I'd recommend doing is starting out with around 30 minutes of heart rate based zone 3 training, then seeing what pace that correlates to or what power that correlates to if you're using either of those metrics. As you get closer towards a marathon, because this is likely the intensity you'll complete your marathon within, you can start to look more at pace and power output as we need more of that biomechanical output, and sometimes heart rate is not the most reliable when we're trying to overreach past that 2-hour mark. But all in all, they work together to ensure that we stay within this range, whether that's any of these metrics, so that we're not getting here and accumulating this. And to do that, you need to know your threshold where you can just do a 30-minute hard run. You could look at your past data. I've got a lot of videos up here where you can see how to do that, or download the guide in the description. I hope that helps. And if you are on Strava, make sure you follow me so you can call me out if I start falling victim to the Strava effect again. See ya.